The idea for this class began with the committee that works on, developing classes for the Marxist school, wanting to present a class on culture, that is the overarching culture of any society, where it comes from, but also of, the media and the arts and how it, reflects and also not only reflects the atmosphere, but also serves to sort of reinforce racism and sexism and homophobia and things such as that, and where that comes from. And it became, over the process of us developing it, this focusing on the media in particular. And I wanted to, but first, before I get into the media and everything like that, and this is a study for me that obviously for all of us, we continue to study and develop and grow as revolutionaries, but particularly in the whole history of how the mores and ideals of the society have been cultivated and been used by the ruling elite, going all the way back to the very foundations. It's very interesting to me. But I wanted to quote from Marx regarding the superstructure of society and where it comes from. And he says in the Critique of Political Economy, an introduction to the critique, I think, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely the relations of production appropriate to a given stage and the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure into which correspond definite forms of consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. And I think at a certain point, the superstructure itself begins to, the cultural and legal practices of that begin to positively or negatively affect the productive life of a society and development. I wanted to, I think it's very interesting to look back at the case of slavery in the United States. And initially, I wanted to talk very much about the differing societies in the North having the interests of the industrial and financial capitalists clashing with the interest of the landed aristocracy in the South. And how that ultimately led to, it was, of course, the conditions of being enslaved, which led to the rebellions of oppressed people and the work stoppages and slowdowns and things of that nature, which are all part of, the rebellion of enslaved and oppressed people. But it was also the interest of the northern industrialists to overturn that slave society, and so they clashed and they fought a war. But I think it's to talk about this society and its cultural, its ideas and all of that, and racism, we have to go all the way back to the foundings of it. And we have to remind ourselves that the wealth of the Western world was built up through some of the most extreme forms of repression and oppression, through slavery and genocide of brown and black people of color all over the world. And that the first truly international trade of going back and forth was the trade in human beings from Africa, which started with human beings from the Western world, the Americas, to Europe, and then Africans all across, across the Atlantic, but also to places in Europe. And that form of super exploitation of African peoples laid the foundation for the capitalist class in this country. And we have oppressed people, indigenous, black people, and Latino people have always served in this country as a form of super exploitation. And so it's always been in the interest of those in control to prevent any linkages of oppressed people with white workers, and to use racism as a way to keep these things from happening, and using oppressed people as a way to sort of keep wages from getting too high by always having, you know, a lower strata of people that white workers could unite against and see as lesser than them because of the color of their skin or their culture. Excuse me. When I began looking at the media, you know, I started with some of the most recent events in history. Of course, obviously with the Trayvon Martin case, but I wanted to go, you know, back beyond that as well. I think that, you know, we say that the media, and you can see it in the drumbeat for war and how the media is actually used and plays a role for the state, and it becomes an arm of the state, really. If you look at Occupy Wall Street, when it first began, they were sort of the media darlings. And when it began to erupt and get bigger and bigger and bigger, you saw that the coverage of it began to change. And then it wasn't about what the Occupy Wall Street movement was against, and it wasn't about these tens of thousands of young people primarily that were brought out into the streets and that were engaged in changing their environment and changing society, but it was about them, the camps themselves, and them being dirty, they're being havens for violence and all of this, when the society outside of the Occupy Wall Street movement is much more violent than what actually occurred within it. But this became the focus, and it was the justification for the violent breakup. And I don't think that anybody in this room is confused into thinking that this wasn't from the very top of the government, where the Department of Homeland Security was very instrumental in demanding that the local police forces crack down on Occupy Wall Street movement, and we saw how brutal and efficient they were in doing so. And it was interesting at the early, when they first tried doing that, it led to bigger and bigger, a much more mass response. But when the media began to turn on it, and it changed a little bit. Actually, it changed drastically, in fact. But I went back and looked at, there was a period in this history, and I think that the case of Trayvon Martin is very much like what happened with the young brother Emmett Till. But I went back and looked at, there was a period in history where the official records between 1889 and I think 1919, they say about 3,000, primarily black people, about 2,800 black men, 50 black women, and some whites were lynched in this country. Now, we know from reports that usually when they give a number like that, the actual number is probably twice as much as what they're actually giving. And you have to look at who actually defines what lynching is. So I went back and I paid specific attention to the year 1919 and the massacres of black people, the white racist riots, really, against black people. And there was a, and I was looking at some of the headlines of that era, and you'd be, I mean, you shouldn't be surprised, but you'd really be surprised. I mean, but you shouldn't be, but you are when you look at these things, because we know what the Wall Street Journal is and what New York Times, what these newspapers are, but you know, even in earlier periods, we would expect them to not have such, you know, such racist headlines justifying the massacre and murdering of people is simply what it was. There was a report by Dr. George Haynes to a Senate Judiciary Committee that was supposed to investigate these lynchings that talked about at that particular year, I think during that summer, there were 38 riots in cities all across the country. And most of them were, you know, for the same reasons. And that was because black people were organizing or trying to organize and fight for their rights.